Good morning, everyone. My name is Chile Eboe-Osuji. I, um, until 2021, I served in The Hague as the president of International Criminal Court. I now live in Toronto. From where my new job is to act as to teach law to law students and international relations to political science students in Canada and in the USA. It is my great honor to open this panel today on the subject of journalism, the fate of journalism in the digital age. The title of our segment is Silenced: Democracy, Journalism, and Censorship in the Digital Age. In taking on that topic, we cannot avoid the paradox of the D, the contradiction in the idea that you would have tension between digital age and democracy. And what am I talking about? As we speak, I'm writing a book, and in doing on accountability of power. It's called the I hope to call it the accountability imperative. Now, I'm doing that without visiting a library. I'm sitting on my desk. All the resources I need are there. All the libraries I need to consult are online. And where I can find a book online, then what do? I look up Amazon.com and order the book, and it comes to my house. Again, that is the promise of the digital age. But as I'm doing that as well, writing that book, I'm worried. Here comes a paradox. I'm worried in the other room, are my children really doing their homework, or are they spending all the time playing computer games? Worse still, who are they playing the computer games with? Are they who they really promised they are on the other end of the line? That is the contradiction of the digital age, and we see that in journalism as well. We are talking about the promise of the internet that promised greater democratization of freedom of expression, where your favorite journalist who may be working with a big corporation, a media corporation, may have a disagreement or parting of ways with his or her employer, and then decide, okay, I'm going to start a small digital press or a blog that will take off from there, and through there, I will continue to do my job of integrity. So that is the promise of democracy in the digital age, greater democracy to freedom of expression. But it's not quite that simple, because you can also see how power can as well overwhelm that promise. The power of political power to begin with, or the power of money. The same corporation that would be the employer of this journalist may well can would have greater play in that digital milieu. It's worse than that. I return now to the problem of political power in the digital age. I was watching a certain documentary. It's been a while now. I think it was last year. I was a guest on the Dutch. They've got this movies that matter festival every year, and we had to watch a bunch of movies, and there was that documentary on what happened to the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, how that man was hounded in the digital milieu. Now, I don't know whether there has been investigation done to pinpoint precisely whether digital abuse played a direct role in his murder. But we know that, or from that documentary I was talking about, he was massively harassed in the digital milieu, where those who were against him will marshal an army of bots, as it were, going after him in every way that they could. And that is what we are talking about when we talk about, when I say the D paradox, how the promise of democracy gets diluted or, as a matter of fact, subverted in the digital age. And that's where we are. So what happened to Mr. Khashoggi, it's not entirely that unusual from what we hear. It may not be as drastic as that, but that's drastic enough that one journalist is hurt in that way in the digital age, let alone all the other things that happen to journalists in the digital age, journalists who do not have the same level of power as those who go after them. Could be women journalists who are trolled and harassed in the digital age using the internet and online. It could be the average secret service of a country whose leader or whose leaders do not like what journalists are reporting, who would use the online forum to hack the journalists, making their lives miserable and the lives of their sources at risk, putting their lives at risk. And that is what we are talking about here. And as we mark the World Press Freedom in this conference, we stand in solidarity with those truth reporters, the journalists. It is they that help democracy work, and it is they that push autocracy onto the path of democracy, or at least try to do that. It is absolutely wrong and detrimental to all that the rule of law and democracy stands for, that journalists should be at risk in any way, including through online harassment. They are vital to the rule of law. Without them, the rule of law cannot work. As you know, I come from the legal field, a judge in the International Criminal Court until now. The work of judges, you can see certain correlation between that and what journalists do. Alexander Hamilton, many years ago, Americans will remember the story of Alexander Hamilton. They called him one of the America's founding fathers. He wrote in the Federalist Paper number 78 that judges or the judiciary, all they have, they do not have the power of force or will. All they have is their judgment, the right. You look at journalists do not even have the judgment that judges have. They don't have the power of writing judgments that bind people. But what they have is the power of the word. They use their word through broadcast or written press to report and shine spotlight on errors of society, on abuses of power. And that is why we need them. And that's why the rule of law and democracy needs them. When I finished my service at the ICC, and this year I was invited to join the panel, high-level panel on coalition, sort of high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. This is a group of 15 judges and lawyers from across the world who serve as the advisory body to Media Freedom Coalition. The coalition was originally an initiative of Canada and the UK, but nowadays Canada and the Netherlands play the leading role in that effort, in that coalition. The coalition now counts 52 countries and growing across 6 continents. As the high-level panel, our remit is to provide legal advice and recommendation to the coalition and its partners, including international organizations, for the specific purpose of promoting and protecting vibrant, free, and independent media. And I will be handing over now to Mr. Pedro Vaca, who is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission, to coordinate and moderate this session. It's my great honor to do so, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Judge Chile Eboe-Osuji. It is an honor for me to moderate this panel. First of all, good morning and welcome to the Americas region. This is a very special day, the World Press Freedom Day. And this panel comes in a very sensitive moment of humanity, not only because it's after the pandemic, but also because it's the first time the community of freedom of expression gets together. We've for so long been expecting this moment, and I'm honored to be in this space. I would like to thank, first of all, the International Bar Association for the effort of organizing this event, to UNESCO, to the high-level panel and the the legal advisory group, and extending the possibility of discussing about these issues. It was in 1985 when the Inter-American Court stated that freedom of expression constitutes a primary and basic element of the public order and democracy, and that also the threats to the freedom of the press have always represented a risk to democracies, and authoritarian regimes have always entitled censorship in order to try to sustain the public debate in its own terms. So when we talk about censorship and censorship in the digital age, we're also talking about the fight against authoritarianism and the fight for freedom and democracy. Those challenges include digital surveillance, which is a topic we're going to discuss today here, and also the disinformation and the spyware analytics. So with these brief remarks and with a warm welcome, I would like to present to you our speakers today. First of all, Ms. Catherine Amirfar, Deputy Chair of the High-Level Panel. She's also co-chair of the Debevoise International Dispute Resolution Group and the Public International Law Group. Mrs. Amirfar is also the most recent president of the American Society of International Law. Welcome, Ms. Amirfar. Then we have Professor Danilo Milo. He's a member of the high-level panel as a partner at Weber Wentzel Attorneys in Johannesburg, in South Africa. Professor Milo is adjunct professor at the University of Witwatersrand and the author of Defamation and Freedom of Speech, published by the Oxford University Press. Welcome. We have also Maria J. Schack. Please apologize if I am not pronouncing your name well. also a member of the high-level panel, international director at Stanford University, in the Cyber Policy Center and International Policy Fellow of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and former member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party in the period of 2009 to 2019. And we have also here in presence Ms. Rodica Kiochina, did I say it well? Program Officer of the Media and Internet Governance Unit of the Information Society Department at the Directorate of General for Human Rights and Rule of Law at the Council of Europe. So I would invite you, you have like the time limit. I will ask you if there's like more time than expected, and I ask you to be brief. And first of all, I would like to invite Ms. Catherine Amirfar, who's going to share some thoughts about these challenges about digital censorship and how the work of this community could improve the conditions of journalism. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I would like to thank UNESCO for organizing, to you, Pedro, for moderating, and to my fellow panel members for participating. It's really a privilege to be here with you, if not in person. So as Chile mentioned, the high-level panel is the independent advisory body of the Media Freedom Coalition, and that is a coalition of the 52 countries that came together specifically to work proactively to advocate for media freedom at home and abroad. So in addition to providing legal advice and recommendations to the coalition and its partners, the panel also provides individual states with legal advice in the form of legal opinions on draft legislation or current legislation implicating media freedoms, as well as amicus curiae opinions in media freedom cases of general public import. So it's a very active body. It's independent and advisory in function, and obviously very much focused on the key issues implicating media freedom. So we're here today to talk about the silencing of journalists. As we'll hear, such silencing takes many forms. In many cases, it takes the form of directly targeting journalists. Yesterday, I joined a panel sponsored by RSF on the reach of Pegasus and other spyware technology being used to target journalists for harassment and in some cases assassination. And the scope of such activity is staggering. As we'll hear a bit more, tens of thousands of devices have been targeted, affecting journalists, human rights activists, civil society, and political leaders. And this is activity that's across the globe, with implications in the US, the UK, the Middle East, Europe, Mexico, El Salvador. It's not a problem of one country or one region, but a global issue. And as we'll also see, silencing is manifest in numerous politically motivated lawsuits that criminalize speech by independent journalists who are doing their jobs, including in criticizing governments where they fall short, as defamation or fraud or terrorism. Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa eloquently speaks to the steep personal cost of pretextual charges filed in the Philippines against her for her work as an independent journalist. And I know that we're hearing this week at the Media Freedom Day stories time and time again of journalists and how they are facing the extraordinary pressures of being targeted, especially through the use of cyber tools. And the silencing of journalists and the accompanying suppression and distortion of facts that we see can also take the form of broader systemic measures, including internet shutdowns. Disturbingly, internet shutdowns are becoming part of a playbook by autocratic regimes intent on suppressing free dissemination of information, including in the context of active armed conflict. I fear no conversation about media freedom can ignore the events in the Ukraine. Ukrainian journalists, like all of their fellow citizens, are facing direct threats to their life, as are the hundreds of international journalists reporting from the battlefield. And equally troubling, are reports of hackers specifically targeting journalists. And the Russian government is tightly controlling and censoring news coverage about the conflict in Russia, including by blocking access to Facebook and major foreign news outlets, and enacting a law to punish anyone spreading so-called false information about the invasion with up to 15 years in prison. We see how control of the media and intimidation and disinformation can be embedded in war strategy. In response, the Media Freedom Coalition issued a joint statement on 10 March condemning both Russia and Belarus for these actions. And this is unfortunately not the only example. The coalition has also issued joint statements for similar actions taken in Belarus and Myanmar. And likewise, Ethiopia, in the context of the conflict in the Tigray, has intermittently severed internet and mobile phone connectivity to the entire region. This is one of the actions at issue in a recent landmark complaint filed by my law firm, along with Legal Action Worldwide and Pan-African Lawyers Union, before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. These are just a few examples, and we're seeing this time and time again, this comprehensive, coordinated government effort to cut off independent information, silence victims of atrocities, and cripple the gathering of evidence of human rights violation. So moving to the HLP and the MFC and what we're doing about this. The MFC has been quick to condemn actions related to digital censorship, and that is an important step. But such statements in the face of this wholesale crisis of silencing can only go so far. The high-level panel is working with the coalition member states, individually and collectively, to take concrete steps. In the first couple of years of its existence, the HLP produced 4 advisory reports that recommend a number of actions that we say states can and ought to take to improve the protection afforded to journalists and the media. And they cover key areas in 4 respects. First, the establishment of a system of emergency visas for journalists at risk of arbitrary arrest or violence in their home countries. Second, the development of a robust system of consular support for journalists facing arrest, prosecution, and detention overseas. Third, the use of targeted travel and financial sanctions against individuals and entities responsible for targeting journalists. And finally, the building of capacity to properly investigate abuses in order to assure greater accountability, including through the creation of an independent investigative task force. We're working closely with key MFC member states to implement these recommendations. An important further step in the panel's focus on digital censorship in particular is in the next phase of work. I look forward to the discussions with my fellow panel members in taking this forward. And thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Madam Catherine Amirfar, for your remarks. And definitely, digital censorship is not an isolated threat. It's very linked, as you said, with the analogical challenges that journalists face. I would like to invite Mrs. Maria J. Schack, who's going to share with us some thoughts about global spyware and disinformation. You're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person. That would have definitely been more pleasant, but it's an honor and a pleasure to join as a new member of this high-level panel, but to talk about an old obsession of mine, which is the surveillance industry. But before anything, on this World Press Freedom Day, let me start by saluting all the journalists and editors and bloggers and fixers whose work remains a struggle in so many corners of the world. Maria Ressa in the Philippines has been mentioned, rightfully so, but I also want to think about all the journalists that are being silenced by the Kremlin in Russia today, or who are living in fear and under siege in Ukraine. At the same time, on this World Press Freedom Day, I'm encouraged by the inventiveness of the use of open sources to ensure a digital spotlight on the many wrongdoings our world is seeing and about the new paths towards justice. Clearly and ongoingly, a free press is key to holding those in power to account. But the most powerful who fear tough questions or accountability of their dark dealings, or who simply do not want to see platforms for critical voices, now have access to uniquely powerful tools to consolidate their grips on power and on speech even more forcefully. The spyware industry has been allowed to make and sell products that are systematically violating human rights. I think we have to understand that this industry consists of tools that are designed, marketed, and sold to violate universal human rights. Now, I personally first learned about the use of EU-made monitoring tools when they were used against human rights defenders around the Arab uprisings already more than a decade ago. And if someone would have told me then, as a fresh member of the European Parliament, that these systems would only become more sophisticated and that democratic states would be reluctant to curb this powerful industry, I probably would not have believed them. But here we are today. The global spyware industry is powerful, and it threatens and violates a number of rights, such as the right to privacy, and in particular, source protection of journalists. And these rights are all interlinked. So the right to their freedom of speech, because access to all their communications can be forged by these tools that are made for hacking and sold commercially. It can lead to self-censorship, direct censorship, but also intimidation, which is a real risk and consequence of the spyware industry. Think about what it feels like to know that your every moves may be tracked and traced, and what that in turn means for mapping networks of sources and fellow contacts. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi has been mentioned, and we know that his contacts have been surveilled, and that is one of the most dramatic examples of how journalists suffer from the surveillance industry. But let's zoom in on one particular example and see how broadly it is harmful. NSO Group, which is the maker of hacking tools. They're not the only company, but their very notorious tool called Pegasus has thankfully been on the front pages and in the headlines much more over the past year because it allows us to understand what is going on. Pegasus software can infiltrate phones and devices without the owner having to do anything such as clicking on a link. So with zero-click infiltrations, it can access devices and has been found on the phones of journalists in France working for France 24 in the UK, editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, but also on the devices of journalists in countries like El Salvador. This is really a global problem. And thankfully, the Pegasus project, which consisted of a number of investigative journalists uncovering this industry's darkest secrets and working together with civil society groups like the Citizen Lab and Amnesty International's digital forensics team, they have been doing crucial work to inquire how exactly the malware works that allows for this stealthy access. Basically, whoever can afford it anywhere in the world can buy access to top-level intelligence capabilities, not because they represent a state with key interests or unique talents, but because they can buy such services that have now been entirely privatized. And I think that this availability of hackers for hire should worry governments. And instead of them buying and embracing these tools for their own agendas, unfortunately, it's a dirty secret that all over the world, that is exactly what governments are doing. Democracies in particular should seek transparency and accountability of this toxic industry. Now, the EU has started to put up some guardrails through new export control law. It took a long time, but it has become harder to export surveillance technologies from the European Union and its member states to known human rights violators. But unfortunately, and let's keep the EU as an example here, the concern does not stop at the exports of these systems, but we should also look at their imports. It is well known now that in Hungary and Poland, people have been targeted, including journalists. For example, Zabel Jpani of Direct 36 in Hungary learned that spyware was found on his phone, and that meant that his data, photos, locations, email, and contacts had all been compromised. Imagine that his camera on his device and the microphone might have been remotely accessed and activated, turning his own personal phone into an eavesdropping tool. And the problem, and I'll stop here, is that no target, whether it is the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, French President Macron, or the Prime Minister of Spain, seem to be off limits for this system of hacking and spying tools. And so a very daunting message comes from the fact that this industry continues to be able to operate worldwide. And I think that is that as long as this type of hacking and surveillance technologies are around, democratic rights, privacy rights, personal safety, and certainly press freedom are at stake. So I hope that today we can focus once more on the harms that come from this commercial spyware industry, how it hurts journalists, but many others too, and that it is time to act.
Thank you, Madame Schack, for your remarks. Definitely, it's scary the numbers of surveillance when we look at Pegasus, for example, and how it's spread, but also the story of journalists. Now, what does it mean in the daily life? What does it mean for their work, for their sources? It's definitely something so scary. So I would like to invite our third panelist, Mr. Dario Milo, who is going to share some thoughts about cyber targeting of journalists and also internet shutdowns examples. Welcome.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur Vaca. It was good to meet you in person in Washington a few weeks ago, and it's a great honor to address this conference on the important topic of digital censorship on this World Press Freedom Day. I'd like to offer observations briefly on three themes on this topic, from the perspective of how law can and should play a role in addressing some of these challenges. The first is digital surveillance, and we've already heard from my colleague Mariki eloquently about how global spyware is a major threat to media freedom. Of course, she's right. Law is only one response to this threat, and it's not even a particularly effective response because it cannot fully regulate the unlawful surveillance sanctioned by governments and powerful actors who can engage in, as she put it, hacking for hire. But at least law can reiterate the international standards that are required to be applied by governments who take media freedom and source protection seriously in this context. And I would commend to the international free speech community a decision of South Africa's Constitutional Court in favor of my client, the leading investigative journalism outfit in South Africa, Amabungane. And just over a year ago, our Constitutional Court here struck down South Africa's surveillance laws on various grounds, but most importantly for journalists on the basis that there is a need for post-surveillance notification, which will be a concept familiar to many of you, but also specifically that surveillance poses a threat to journalist sources and that this requires safeguards to be built into any surveillance legislation. And the practical way forward in the interim, according to the court, is that any government actor seeking a warrant to survey a journalist needs to notify the judge who is empowered to grant the warrant of that fact and explain why the surveillance is necessary. So perhaps a partial response and at least an interim procedural and substantive safeguard. The Constitutional Court in that case also struck down bulk surveillance, which was being engaged in by the South African government, and of course is the practice of many governments around the world, because there was no statutory authority, there was no law to justify such a widespread invasion of the privacy of citizens' communications. So responses from domestic and regional courts in these kinds of cases, to my mind, enable us to have the international law toolkit to call out disproportionate and unlawful surveillance wherever it may occur and however it may occur. The next theme is weaponizing social media and other platforms to intimidate, harass, threaten, and assault journalists and other truth tellers, sometimes through sophisticated disinformation campaigns, sometimes through the blunt instrument of direct and often anonymous harassment and threats to physical safety. In many ways, this weaponization is the digital analog, if you pardon my dreadful pun, to slap lawsuits, but without the perpetrators of this weaponization even bothering to get lawyers to issue frivolous but chilling lawsuits. Because the intention of this online harassment, this online violence is the same: to stifle criticism, to censor critical speech, to punish journalists for doing their jobs. And as a study last year by Reporters Without Borders found, 73% of gender-based violence against women journalists occur online. Now, there are important legal victories that can be achieved in this context in domestic and regional courts. But ultimately, and I quote here the words of Ferial Haffajee, who's one of South Africa's leading editors, she said, "I'm not sure that the battle against online violence," and she said this in the context of herself being the victim of smear campaigns and these kinds of assaults online, "I'm not sure that the battle against online violence will be won in the courts, but I do know it will be won by the powerful social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Google, doing more to prevent technology being weaponized in the way that it has been." And this serves as an important reminder that the tech companies need to be part of the technological and the legal solution to online violence and harassment of journalists. And finally, Special Rapporteur, if I may say a few words around internet shutdowns. Much as the major sources of disinformation against journalists may these days come from those who abuse social media platforms provided by tech companies, certainly one would not want them to be shut down as they have been in the past by many autocratic regimes. And as Catherine said, this is becoming a playbook for many autocratic governments around the world. In one study, it was reported that since 2015, 34 out of 54 African countries have blocked access to social media platforms in the last 6 years or so. And therefore, it's of major significance that earlier this year, the Columbia University Freedom of Expression Project handed down its prize for the most significant freedom of expression legal precedent in the last 2 years to the Community Court of Justice of the Economic Community of West African States. And that was in relation to its 2020 decision in the Amnesty International case. And that involved the Togo government responding to protests in 2017 by shutting down the internet, ostensibly on the basis of national security. And the court, importantly, to remind everyone, affirmed that internet access is a right that derives from freedom of expression. States are required to protect internet access, and that Togo had acted in the absence of any specific law that allowed it to shut down the internet, and that was a violation of the African Charter. So the message I leave journalists on this World Press Freedom Day is really an echo of what Catherine, our deputy chair of the panel, said earlier on, that at the panel we recognize how digital censorship is profoundly anti-democratic, and we look forward in this next phase of the panel's work to working with the free speech community to attempt to address it. Thank you, Special Rapporteur.
Thank you, Mr. Milo. And before my summary remarks for this, I would like to thank the high-level panel, because when this project started in mid-2019, the community was thirsty about help in legal frames, legal paths, legal roads. This is a community mainly built by people that are based in newsroom, people that is focused on informing society, but the legal atmosphere, the judiciary knowledge, even the international standards on this. I mean, there's a huge work, and we, as a community, we need assistance, we need guidance, we need discussions with experts like the high-level panel to light the path, because I mean, darkness seems to be close to journalism in this age. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Rodica Kiochina, who's going to share a perspective about what the Council of Europe is looking at part of these problems. Welcome, Rodica.
Thank you, Pedro. Good morning, everyone. It's always a little bit difficult to be the last speaker, also trying to say something interesting after all we have heard. But I'll try to briefly go over what we look at the Council of Europe related to censorship. We live in a digital era where digital technologies have expanded individuals' and groups' ability to receive and impart information, but also in an era where the range and diversity of this information has increased considerably. We also go through global pandemics and hybrid wars, where propaganda and disinformation not only threaten the reliability of information, but also present security threats. As we heard yesterday, the last year Guillermo Cano Prize, Dmitry Muratov, hybrid wars start much before the real wars. And if I can add, they continue much after that as well. In such times, it is more difficult than ever to find the right balance between free speech and interference with it, between engaging incentives and imposing sanctions, between prioritizing individual rights or national security. It is also an era, as it was mentioned before by everyone, where journalists face many challenges, starting from pressure and intimidation to the most primitive sorts of attacks and violence. In an annual report by the Council of Europe Platform for the Protection of Journalists and Safety of Journalists, which was released last week, it also refers to one of the topics confirmed yesterday also by Khadija Ismailova, but by previous speakers as well, that journalists are not the only victims of the surveillance, but also this use of investigatory powers threaten their sources and whistleblowers. Also, all trends stay there, even during new phenomena, as we saw. Due to actions taken by national authorities in response to COVID-19, in many cases invoked as a pretext for restrictive measures. Now, measures like sanctions can be used against purveyors of disinformation, as it was in crisis times, but we should be mindful that legitimate concerns for information integrity do not result in a regulation which itself undermines freedom of expression. In some states, legislation and practices seeking to prevent disinformation and panic resulted in very vaguely framed restrictions, wholesale blocking of websites, non-judicial takedown requests, and broadcast bans, as we still see now today during the war times too. In addition to the pattern of intrusive, almost Orwellian style, if I may, surveillance mentioned earlier, arbitrary arrest and detention have been recorded, judicial harassments through vexatious legal threats and criminal prosecutions of journalists on spurious charges of terrorism or treason. Most notably, strategic lawsuits against public participation, also as mentioned by Professor Milo, and called SLAPs, were aimed increasingly at discouraging media and journalists from reporting public interest topics. Finally, given that we talk about the digital era, we must look at the impact of the digital technologies, which create new forms of interference with freedom of expression. Blocking, filtering, removal of illegal and harmful online content can only be managed at a scale with the help of algorithms, which are developed and run by platforms. Very often, this personalized distribution of information via socials and other platforms also result in a digital divide, where some creating a sort of censorship, where some categories do not have access to all information, while others who do dominate the public discourse. At the Council of Europe, where we have a human rights, rule of law, and democracy approach, we did address all the above through various activities and standards aiming at offering guidance to member states, but also to internet intermediaries, academia, civil society, and users themselves. As regards the particular COVID context, The governments were provided with practical guidelines for dealing with this unprecedented sanitary crisis in a way that respects the fundamental values. These tools looked at how criminal sanctions have the greatest effects on freedom of expression and how the sanctions can only be justified in exceptional circumstances, especially when one's right to freedom of expression is used for ends which are contrary to the text of the Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights. However, even in such cases, the criteria for restrictions need to be clearly determined in law and accompanied by procedural safeguards. The same applies for any restrictions to, including like the broadcasting bans. In the area of the safety of journalists, to go to the recently adopted instruments, we brought this topic at a ministerial level last year in a conference where we were happy to have the high-level panel representatives participate, by the way. And we had a resolution on the safety of journalists adopted. Through it, member states committed to make protection of journalists a political priority. But of course, our work on that started much earlier, with roots going deeper back in 2016, for example, where member states adopted a recommendation which then became a key standard-setting document on the protection of journalists and safety of journalists and other media actors, providing specific guidelines to member states in areas of prevention, protection, prosecution, promotion of information, education, and awareness raising. After its adoption, it was clear that more was needed, though, in terms of concrete implementation of such a document. So we produced an implementation guide with concrete suggestions, including a selection of valuable practices developed in member states, references to the relevant case law of the court, European Court of Human Rights, and the other sources that can inform a law and policy making, and with clear indicators and a self-assessment mechanism. Going back to the digital era, we also tackled and addressed the impact of digital technologies on freedom of expression. Some guidelines appended to a recommendation under the same title address adverse impacts and enhance positive ones of this widespread use of digital technologies, and cover areas like the digital infrastructure design and user empowerment, the transparency, accountability requirements, redress where harm has been caused, and guarantees for platform-held information for independent researchers to underpin evidence-based lawmaking. Much was discussed these days about content moderation, where, if applied improperly, can also interfere with freedom of expression. There too, we have developed guidance, taking into account existing good practices for policy development, regulation, and use in the online environment. And it is also important because it addresses internet intermediaries. Focuses on human rights by default, transparency, clear legal and operational framework, proportionality, safeguards against overcompliance and discrimination, and independent review mechanism. We have ongoing activities focusing on specific aspects of the safety of journalists, like committee working on SLAPS, which was mentioned before, mis and disinformation, hate speech, and use of digital tools, including AI for journalism and sustainable media financing. I think I will conclude here saying that in times of crisis or war, being it offline or online, the role of journalists must be respected and protected, as along with their voice, we risk at silencing the voice of democracy itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodica Chiokina, for your remarks. And we are just running a little bit out of time, but this is the moment where arbitrary moderator tries to deal with the situation. So I would suggest, if you agree, that we take these 10 minutes left to have another round of talks. I will start by saying that this conference is not only a space to share, but I think it's an opportunity to ask, to suggest to the UNESCO conference, to the people that is here, which could be good actions, coordination activities that could be useful for the challenge we're facing together. So I would start by myself while you think, and in the same order, I will give you the floor for a couple of minutes, and I think we will reach it. So from the perspective of the office I lead at the Organization of American States, there is a paradox now, and I'm talking about surveillance of journalists. Most of this sort of software is supposedly to be exclusively sold to governments, and we have evidence, is not a suspicion, that there are several journalists spied, deeply spied with this software, but in the middle there's no transparency, there's not enough information, there's like a lack of information, and it's hard because this is, in 2022, we have a lot of international standards of transparency, access to information, how to make accountable the public sphere. So I would put that there. I think there is an intersection between transparency and making accountable these denounces. The second is a dilemma, and we have legitimate activities in democracy. We do not protect journalists as a privileged people. We protect them because they play a role in a democracy to protect the public debate. That's what we protect: the activity, not exclusively the person, which is sometimes people is not aware of that. But it's when we look at the figures, when we look at the documented cases. It seems that it's not understood as a special protected activity, and it instead is assumed as a preferred surveillance people. People that should be surveilled by governments or by whoever is behind this software. And third, there's a challenge about how do we investigate the perpetrators? Which is the level of responsibility that is behind these attacks? And what has to be fixed more than the judiciary decision? What has to be fixed in society for that not to happen again? Because technology is going to bring us, to bring them more ideas, more developments. Now we're talking about Pegasus. In 10 years, we're going to be talking about other tool. But how do we fix society for a social defense of that? And I'm talking about democratic values. So, and that's where I think the high-level panel is very interesting, because it's like building bridges between what is happening in internal and international law. That's why the presence of the Council of Europe here is important, because we need multilateral conversations too. But we need some empathy, some connection with the victims too. Which is going to be our approach to the victims, because there are lives stacked. We have female journalists in El Salvador that are scared of the information that was collected. The potential future violence with that information is something that concerns us all. So with this, I will go back in the same order for offering you time to a short remarks about the future in suggestions. So, Ms. Catherine Amirfar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'll focus on 3 points. One, in that we've done a pretty rapid round robin about silencing. It's pretty clear that silencing has many faces when it comes to the silencing of journalists, whether it's global spyware, other forms of cyber targeting, weaponization of social media, Slack lawsuits, internet shutdowns. There's a lot of aspects to this, but taken together, the impact is profound for our democracy. So I think there's good news in the sense of consensus that we are in a place of crisis, that we have vulnerable among us in the form of journalists and media freedoms, and that action needs to be taken. And that takes me to the second point, which is the form of the action. I think Dario is very wise in pointing out that we're lawyers. We naturally pivot to the law as the solution for all things. And while it is a response, it is an arrow or in our quiver and the toolkit for responding, it is but one. And what we really need is an all of society response, where we have lawyers, where we have the tech companies who are part of the solution, because here we're sitting at the intersection of public and private sector. We're sitting in an intersection of highly technical area where some journalists will never get the level of transparency and understanding to help themselves when they are being cyber targeted. So there's a lot here, and we're playing where there's an intersection in terms of national security issues, which are of paramount importance for states. So that balancing of human rights and national security considerations also complicates the picture. And that takes me to the third point, which is political will. I will say, having come from the high-level ministerials that took place in Tallinn in February with the states and listening to the 52 countries who've come to the table, who have said, this is a priority. We understand the crisis. We understand the democracy at stake, and we are willing to prioritize. And there you start to feel the all of society efforts where states play a role, where lawyers play a role, where tech companies play a role. And that brings me to, I think, what the high-level panel is animated to do, which is, yes, to get individuals to understand where we are in terms of the issues being discussed. There's an educational component, there's a discussion component, but there's also an action component. And I will say, from the perspective of the deputy chairs, that in this phase of work, we're very much focused on concrete actions, marrying up victims, journalists with the tech companies who can assist them when they are cyber targeted, but thinking concretely about what states can do in this space to promote media freedoms. And that's our task. And I think that the political will is there. And I think that the talent that you see on the high-level panel, working in coalition with you, the community of civil society and journalists who are on the front lines, can really make a difference here. So with that, let me hand it over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Amirfar. We are with a couple of minutes. I have a hand raised here. Judge, okay.
Well,
I thought you, because you took the mic.
Well, I can just quickly chime in, and the point has been made that this is not about protecting sacred cows as such. And of course, yes, indeed, in a sense, journalists are that because they help to sustain democracy. But this is a general issue of a good thing that could go badly, which is technology, the level at which it is. For example, I mean, while we talk about the need to protect journalists, I began by talking in my main comments about the paradox of the D, or the paradox of you being able to write a book sitting in your desk when almost 40 years ago I had to go to a library to write my Bachelor of Law degrees, a thesis, any page in it, you had to do that. But here we are in the age of technology that's supposed to help us. We have to worry, for instance, the level at which the same technology is being used to fan the flames of genocide, for example, right? And that's the extreme form of it. And it's important that while the journalists are not a sacred cow, it's important that their plight now helps us to get a clear focus on this danger in order to discuss it and start finding solutions to it. We don't have the answers, but at least the discussion has started. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I will go back to Marietje. Do you have like a few remarks, like closing remarks?
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think this panel once again confirms what journalists all over the world know, what jurists all over the world know, what human rights defenders all over the world know, which is that there is a hypocrisy gap, there is an accountability gap, and it needs to be closed. I think Catherine made a clear point that political will is needed. And I would say leadership by example, particularly from democratic countries that claim to want to defend universal human rights. You cannot credibly, on the one hand, condemn violations, censorship, repression of a free press in diplomatic statements, while companies that are based in your jurisdiction continue to sell the tools that are designed, marketed, and sold to violate those same human rights.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor now to Dr. Milo.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. Not much more to add in the very brief moments I have, except to say that just to re-emphasize what Catherine said, we've thrown around a lot of ideas. The conference has also surfaced a number of problems and challenges. It is going to take, the law is always multiple steps behind technological developments, and that's been a perennial problem for decades. It's going to take a multidisciplinary approach to grapple with some of the critical issues. And the political will is necessary because ultimately this is about protecting democracy, enhancing democracy. Democracy is what is at peril if we don't collectively get these issues right. So I would simply emphasize that it is too much to expect the law to answer all of these problems. The first step is to call the problems out and crystallize what they are, but it's going to take a multidisciplinary response. And as the high-level panel, hopefully we can play a role in developing that response in conversation with so many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rodica.
Yeah, so just to add a few things, of course, a political will is needed, but taking it back a little bit to the digital part, the complex digital ecosystem we face, it is indeed a shared responsibility of both public and private actors, and also users to contribute to make full use of these digital technologies and innovation through a human rights rule of law approach. And multidisciplinary approach indeed is needed, including technological experts, and also for the users, the media and information skills. And we should also move faster because as we stay here and speak about digital technologies and internet as we know it, there are other forms of versions of internet that are already being developed that will bring new challenges. I'm thinking of immersive realities and the metaverses that are already on the way. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank to all of you the opportunity, and especially to IBAHRI inviting me to be part of this session. At the end, we have political will, political commitment as a huge next step. It should be an easy step, but unfortunately it's not. Count on me at the Organization of American States. I will send that message, and I hope we can keep working together. Thank you. This is formally closed, though. It is.
I guess so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining the panel. Bye-bye.